welcome everybody, thanks for coming. It's brilliant to see you here, and let's hope we have a really good afternoon. I just want to introduce the speakers, but first I just want to say one of our speakers is in hospital, Sharon McCall, who comes from Dunfermline and works at the Carnegie Library in Dunfermline, and is going to be our expert on Carnegie, and unfortunately she can't come. So we wish her all the best. And there's a card on the table, or the, what do you call it, on the side table. We send it to her to wish her a good, to wish her well. And if anyone likes to sign that, that would be good. Okay, so the more signatures we get on there, the better. And right, so having said that, Sharon's place has been taken, thank you, thank you, heaven to God, by Martin Gollan, who works in the voluntary sector in the area, County Durham, Newcastle, is a practicing artist at the studio, at the Biscuit Tin Studio in Newcastle, and he is heavily involved in setting up the Other. In case you don't know what the Other is, it's a grassroots network. Again, it was created as a response to the Great Exhibition of the North, which a lot of us feel was a false setup. It was something like £5 million came up north and was spent in particularly Newcastle mostly. And artists got very, very little out of it. So that created the Other. So thanks Mark for that. And secondly, we've got Mike Collier. Here's Mike. Artist, writer and curator, trained at Goldsmiths in London, and is a reader. I'm not sure what that means actually.
Well, I'm
a reader.
I'm not anymore, but yeah.
Oh, not anymore a reader. So, not anymore a reader, a professor of visual art at the University of Sunderland. And finally, Chris Mullen, author, journalist. He was the MP for Sunderland for 23 years, is that right, Chris?
Yep.
And the things that I've written down here I thought were very important. He fought to secure release of the Birmingham Six, which I think was a fantastic thing to do. And he's dedicated his latest book to Joe Cox, who was murdered 2 years ago. So thank you, Chris. So I'll hand you over now to Martin Gollan, who is going to chair the rest of the meeting. And best of luck, Martin. Thank you.
It's Tony, tough crowd. We are expecting maybe a few more people to join us this afternoon, so some folk might come through the doors. Before we start, Pat here from Back of the Map is going to say a bit about Back of the Map and also do the housekeeping. But also just to say before that we are kind of trying to take some films, take some photographs and recording some of this afternoon. So if you don't want to feature in any photographs, let us know and we'll try and avoid you. And if we accidentally capture you, then we'll delete you. Just hand over to Pat.
Hiya. Just want to welcome you all today and really thank the Assign Group for all the hard work what they've done over the last few months. This is the second exhibition they've done. The first one was on the Back Ice Park, where the land was gifted to put this lovely building in, and then Mr. Carnegie donated the finances to build 3 libraries in Sunderland using the plans from this centre. The centre itself has been open through Back on the Map for 5 years now. Closed. It was one of the first libraries in Sunderland to be closed, and then Back on the Map through the campaign of local people took over the building. It couldn't have been run without the volunteers, and one of the things we said that we would keep a part of the library, which is run by one of our sign art artists there, Glenda, volunteering, and Raymond. Fundraise endlessly to keep this library going. We've gotten rid of all the old stock from what was left from the City Council, which I think is really important, and brought in new stock. There's about 14 authors on board now donating books all across the country. So our name's getting out there right down south, so it's really good. And Chris Mullen actually opened the doors for us 5 years ago. We didn't expect what we really didn't know. We opened the doors thinking, right, we'll just open the doors and see what happens. And since that day we've had 2,812 individual people. That's not footfall, that's just individuals come through the doors. So it's been a good success, so thank you very much. And just want you to enjoy the rest of the day.
And as we suggested in the Eventbrite page we used for advertising and for booking this afternoon's event, philanthropy is a complicated subject. Obviously linked to charity, charitable giving, but I think it's more complicated than that, and there's other things to consider, and particularly from a perspective of working in the arts or being interested in the arts. So hopefully we'll be able to explore some of those themes this afternoon. But I'll hand over now to Mike.
Okay, thank you. And thanks very much for Assign for inviting me. It's really nice to be here. And apologies for reading this, because those of you that have who I've taught in the past will know that I very rarely read, but it is such a complicated and complex issue, I think, that I thought it might be better to get a real sense of the kind of complexities and the ins and outs of this if I read it. So it's about 15 to 20 minutes long. So I'm going to start by looking briefly at the idea of philanthropy as argued by Andrew Carnegie, which seems appropriate. I'm then going to look at 4 different but nonetheless overlapping approaches to philanthropy, focusing on support for the arts, because that's my area, and I think it is most people here. And then categorise them for the sake of discussion. It's always difficult to categorise things, but it does help to then outline different approaches. I'm going to end with a short summary which outlines my own views and suggestions for a way forward. Firstly, proposing an ideal cooperative way we as artists can work together to support both each other and the community in which we live. And then secondly, suppose a more realistic and agile approach that we as artists can take in the 21st century in order to realise our aims and support ourselves and our families. So just, I'm not glad at all that the lady from the Carnegie Trust isn't here, but I did worry that I might be repeating what she was going to say. So I've now got a little bit of background about Andrew Carnegie. So you probably know more than I do about him, but he was a Scottish-American industrialist, business magnate and philanthropist. He made his money leading the expansion of the American steel industry in the late 19th century and became one of the richest Americans in history. During the last 18 years of his life, he gave away, at the time, $350 million, which is conservatively, in 2019 terms, $65 billion. That's an awful lot of money. To charities, foundations and universities. It represented almost 90% of his fortune. That's quite amazing. I was interested to hear my Scottish colleague, some of you will know her, Dr. Carol Mackay, and I was telling her about doing this, and she said, "Oh, Bonnie, I remember in my childhood, when I used to ask my dad for money, he used to say, 'Who do you think I am? Andrew Carnegie.'" Carnegie wrote an article called The Gospel of Wealth in 1889 that describes the responsibility of philanthropy by the new upper class of self-made rich. He proposed that the best way of dealing with the new phenomenon of wealth inequality was for the wealthy to utilise their surplus means in a responsible and thoughtful manner. This approach was contrasted with patrimony, where wealth is handed down to heirs and other forms of bequest, for instance, where wealth is willed to the state for public purposes. Okay, so I'm going to park this idea of patrician philanthropy now while I look at the next section and then come back to it, for, as many of you know me here, and you might imagine, I have concerns with this approach to patrician philanthropy. Fantastic though it is that so much money is given across. So I'm going to look at 4 interlinked categories of contemporary philanthropy. Before I outline them, I want to make 2 points against which I'm going to examine them. Firstly, and for those of you that know me and are involved in the arts here, I do worry about the idea of new knowledge and originality, something that's perhaps taken for granted in a capitalist neoliberal market. I personally don't like this idea of new knowledge, or what is sometimes branded as originality, and the idea of ownership of knowledge. I suggest that knowledge already and ideas already exist, and they're there to be uncovered and shared. You don't own them. Secondly, and concurrently, as an artist, you might expect me to approve of the idea of individualism. However, as someone who has spent many years working during the Thatcher years of rampant individualism, I've questioned this idea all my life. As a teacher and artist, I'm influenced by the founder of the Bauhaus, Walter Gropius. Whilst in the trenches during the First World War, he devised an ideology for a new school of art and design, a circular interdisciplinary curriculum model. He believed that we teach students a sense of themselves, who they are, and what defines them individually, a sense of individuality, in order that they may make a better contribution to society and to their own community. So I'm now going to outline briefly 4 different headings under which I might loosely call philanthropy operates. And I'm drawing for some of this on a really interesting book by George Monbiot called Out of the Wreckage, and he writes quite regularly in the Guardian, columns of the Guardian. So these are the market, the state, the household, and of course, don't forget that most of us, many artists, in effect sponsor ourselves. And what George Monbiot calls the commons, and this particularly includes cooperative initiatives and things like that. And I think a lot of what's going on here falls absolutely within this area. Of course, such categories are not actually that clearly defined. For example, is the Arts Council of England state funding or funded by the public through direct taxation and from the National Lottery? And of course, there's an overlap in the type of art each of these different categories tends to produce. And this is something that I'm certainly happy to talk about and we'll touch upon briefly as we go through this. However, and just as importantly, I'm really interested to hear what you guys think and to discuss ways of moving forward support for the arts in Sunderland in what I think are, we'd all agree, are challenging times. So let's look first at the market. In this category, I include both businesses and wealthy individuals. So let's go back to Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth, and I'm paraphrasing hugely here. Carnegie argued that surplus wealth is best put to use when it is administered carefully by the wealthy. Carnegie also argues against the wasteful use of capital in the form of extravagance, irresponsible spending, or self-indulgence. Instead, promoting the administration of capital over the course of one's lifetime toward the cause of reducing the stratification between the rich and the poor. You could kind of maybe think that's not a bad idea. But as a result, the wealthy should administer their riches responsibly and not in a way that encourages the slothful, the drunken, or the unworthy. This may seem initially a reasonable and indeed generous use of personal wealth, but in reality, exactly how altruistic is it? Is perhaps the money bestowed on museums, education and the arts used ultimately to support a view and version of culture that underpins the attitudes and interests of those who hold the power that wealth brings? It's true that power, whether in the hands of the state, the church, a multinational company, or an ultra-wealthy individual, has always had the ability to control cultural output and determine what we should and shouldn't see, hear and experience. And artists have always been fighting this through sheer force of their personality. I mean, if you think of Michelangelo, for instance, or Monet, huge figures, Monet with his wonderful water lilies gift to the nation. Or on the other hand, by adopting anarchic cultural strategies. I mean, think of Marcel Duchamp with his urinal and ready-mades, ultimately some of the 20th century's most iconic and influential pieces. Duchamp arguing that it is the artist who declares what is and isn't a work of art, not the state, not the church, not wealthy individuals. Markets tend to support and tend to favour the heroic individual artist, who are not as different as we might think, perhaps, to the type of risk-taking, wealthy entrepreneur who may buy or fund culture and who recognises in the artist a very different but nonetheless kindred soul, quite often white and usually male. There are also recent problematic examples of funding by private wealth, and you guys here who supported the other will be well aware of this. For example, the proposed support by BAE Systems of the Great Exhibition of the North, which I was very uneasy about, not just the funding, but in terms of the way it was organised. I didn't get involved in it at all, for reasons which I'm sure we agree with here. And of course, the support from BAE was pulled out after an outcry from the cultural sector, who were uneasy about accepting the support. So, I mean, companies like BAE or BP and others presumably see such funding of culture as a way of humanising their image. It certainly backfired on both BAE and the Great Exhibition of the North. when the regional campaign, led to this eventual withdrawal of funding. And I'm certainly one who opposed that. What people opposing it wrote was, and it is worth reading this, I hope you don't mind, the charity War Child UK has accused BAE of profiteering from the deaths of innocent children. British arms companies, including BAE, have made more than £6 billion from sales to Saudi Arabia during the ongoing war in Yemen. International humanitarian law prohibits attacks against civilians, yet the British armed Saudi-led coalition has bombed schools, markets, hospitals and health centres. The conflict has killed or injured more than 5,000 children, while survivors face malnutrition and disease with the collapse of infrastructure. UNICEF warns that nearly every child in Yemen is in need of humanitarian assistance. The Great Exhibition of the North claims to offer family-friendly fun. This is totally at odds with its association with BAE Systems. Does this mean that any money given by the wealthy or privileged is bad money? Well, of course not. It's important here to recognise that we as artists should never, I think, assume moral superiority over others. And I've had some fantastic experiences working with committed individuals in both large and small companies, and maybe later on in discussion I can tell you about some of those. I deal with them on a personal level, and I think that's the key thing. I value their support, I listen to their views, as well as explain my own. I engage in a dialogue with them. So let's look at state and state patronage. In terms of state patronage, it's interesting because in the early post-war years of the Arts Council, which I guess most of us would probably think of as the kind of key bit of state patronage that we engage with, one could easily lump that with the two words patronage and patronising. State funding for the arts and other cultural institutions was gifted by an elite few, we might call them cultural gatekeepers, who sat on committees distributing largesse used to enlighten the public, us, to educate us in the ways of a culture only they understood, and so on. And there was minimal accountability. However, as I'm sure some of you will appreciate in this room, we have turned virtually full circle and now have a funding system which is overflowing with accountability, but where the connection between the grant-giving agencies and the individual artist and the community we represent and work for is tenuous, to say the least. The system is now rigorous for sure, but very bureaucratic. The current guidelines for Arts Council support is 92 pages long, and that doesn't include all the links within it, as I'm sure some of you will be aware if you've tried to apply for it. And often lacks personal human engagement. It doesn't encourage the development of a shared culture. Rather, maybe not design, maybe by design, it promotes a very competitive funding environment. We're competing against each other, we're not supporting each other. And what about education? I'm only going to deal here with art schools, though I'm aware of long-standing concerns over the use of private funds to support research in the fields of medicine and science. Up until the early 1960s, artists were taught by the old NDD, National Diploma in Design, which emphasised practice and making. And many of us felt that this education devalued the intellectual discipline involved in making art, kind of tended to put it down. For example, I wasn't actually allowed to take art at A-level because it wasn't considered an academic subject, so I had to do it on my own. Following the two Coldstream reports in the 1960s, the teaching of art design became increasingly academic, an approach which has impacted on both the current approaches to funding, led by a generation of artists and administrators brought up in this climate of thinking. Is this a good thing? It may or may not be, something we could maybe discuss. We also find now that state funding for culture and research is increasingly, but thankfully not entirely, geared to STEM subjects and models of competitive practice. Again, as in my previous example, I should perhaps say here that I've been a grateful recipient of a good deal of public funding from both Arts Council and from HLF. It's a bit like saying at the bottom, I thank the Arts Council for their funding, and we told you do. But I would say that I've also gone out of my way, as some of you will know here, to help dozens of artists in making successful bids for state funding, and I think it's about sharing our expertise, not working competitively. Okay, third one, household. I'll simply say here that many artists and academic researchers fund their own practice. How many of us earn a living from the work that we make? I know only about, I could name them on the, yeah, I've got you smiling on one hand. This, I guess, is inevitable, as our work and so-called downtime are often one and the same thing. However, and this is the point I wanted to make here, we tend to do this either in isolation or competitively rather than collectively. And herein lies the major problem. I think, as lecturers, we should be foregrounding collaboration and collectivism as key skills in equal measure to practical skills. And finally, and the kind of area that I'm most interested in, what George Monbiot calls the commons. The commons outlined in Monbiot's book, which I've put here, called Out of the Wreckage. In it he says that the commons is a complex concept, having several consistent features. It is inalienable. In other words, it should not be sold, nor is it mine to give away. And any resource is not owned in the sense that private property is owned. Yet members of the community have property in it. This library and what you're doing is a classic example of that. You can see now why I'm opposed to this idea of originality of the arts being owned by individuals. He goes on to say that a commons makes sense of community. It provides resources that might help to secure the livelihoods of the community's members, a focus for purposeful engagement, and a basis as the resources belong equally to those who use it for egalitarian relationships. What I might call, to use research terminology, developing non-hierarchical, rhizomatic, cultural self-supporting and collective networks. In other words, it is a collective philanthropy. However, this approach, and this is key, I think, must be underpinned by a number of things, and they relate to the economy, because we can't, any kind of ideology we have can't be set aside the way the economy is run. First of all, a commons collective approach to funding support must have at its heart a commitment to a sustainable living planet. As Monbiot says, currently for mainstream economics, the living planet is an afterthought, or worse, a prayer, along the lines of, and I'm going to quote from him because he's got this nice little prayer: "Dear God, invisible hand, or spirit of Friedrich Hayek," is that how you pronounce his name? He's one of Thatcher's guiding lights. Hayek, yeah. "May our quest for endless economic growth somehow coexist with a viable future for the world's living systems and the people who depend on them. We've no idea how this might happen, but the economy works in mysterious ways. Amen." P.S. Don't worry too much. If you've got too much on, it's no big deal. It's important to recognise that our living world exists outside the realm of market exchange. It does not conform, as Milton Friedman suggests, to market forces. And I don't believe, as Friedman does, that ecological values can find their natural space in the market, like any other consumer demand. Secondly, we can't continue to rely on exponential growth measured against GDP, a flawed monetary measure of gross domestic products, to improve our living conditions. So we need to redefine just what improving our lives can be about. And of course, culture can be a key mechanism to do this. Does this mean abandoning state power or commercial markets? Of course not. We need a hybrid approach, one we as artists can adapt. A system with a positive flow between the market, the state, the household and the commons. For example, why not impose a 5% levy on any works of art sold through the marketplace, through Christie's or Sotheby's or private galleries? The revenues collected could go to a commons collective fund. And of course, I'm not proposing doing away with state or state funding, for even if it is partially flawed and sometimes oppressive, it is, as Monbiot says, all that stands between us and the unmediated power of money and weapons. But I am suggesting that we pay more attention to individual, personal narratives rather than what in research we call meta-narratives. I do think that state funding should be aimed at engineering local collective activities and not, as it currently is, in establishing a competitive grant-giving system based more along the lines of a neoliberal economy than a collective endeavour, a culture which should be based on sharing and critical knowledge transfer. And I'm highly dubious of these ideas coming out where you have a Dragon's Den system of applying for grants and funding. That just doesn't sit easy with me at all. With regards to the household and on a very practical level, perhaps if art schools ran evening classes in city and guilds, plumbing, plastering, carpentry, etc., we could develop again what we used to have before the building industry was regulated, which I'm not opposed to, by the way, but that is a bartering system as part of what I might call a developing cultural collective. So these are just a few ideas for how we might develop this collective or commons philanthropy. So to conclude, Monbiot suggests that our remarkable capacity for altruism and reciprocity has been suppressed by a neoliberal ideology of extreme individualism and competition. Neoliberalism is a powerfully argued story as alienated detractors, but it is a very good narrative, and it does resonate with people. We need another equally compelling narrative. Mongier says, and I paraphrase here, that by confronting the politics of alienation with the politics of belonging, with a collective and commons philanthropy, we can rekindle our imagination, discover our power to act. We can develop collectively a culture of belonging. We, as cultural practitioners, have the ability to imagine such a new approach and to develop a new narrative. It's what we're good at. We're good at imagining. We're good at telling stories. It's our strength. So what I'm suggesting here, I accept, is not a solution, but rather an opening up of a dialogue, and I'd love to know what everyone thinks.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Some of those issues that Mike has raised after the break, but if anyone's got any quick questions or wants to add a point of clarification before we move on, now is a moment to ask those.
I'd just like to ask what's your opinion of, I'm not sure if you did cover this, but what's your opinion of funding of libraries, for instance, funding of museums, funding of galleries by individuals, philanthropy, who are very doubtful, such as BAE, a doubtful governance.
It depends what you mean by doubtful provenance, Tony. I mean, I remember back in the days when Barclays was active in South Africa, we would refuse to either support or accept money from Barclays funds. I'd be wary about accepting funds from some of the oil companies. On the other hand, what I would also say is that if you refuse to discuss or engage with these companies, you're never going to change minds or change people. And there are often within these, and this is why I think it's down to talking to people individually and opening a dialogue rather than just putting two fingers up at them. Difficult. And I think we've got to have, we have as artists and individuals, not, I mean, we're artists, we're not anything special, we are who we are. We're just part of the community. We've got our own moral codes, of course we have, and so do other people, and we have every right to argue with them as they have to argue back with us. I would refuse funding from. I mean, I was absolutely opposed to taking funds from BAE. Although my brother lives in Barrow, and so I had a big argument with him over that.
Debbie, did you want to say?
No, I was going to say something similar. You know, you've got the Tate, long-standing funder of all Tate Modern, Tate Britain. You know, there's that. It's like a juggernaut, and it's difficult sometimes to know how you turn that culture around to a more egalitarian sort of.
I agree. It's funny because when I was curating many years ago, the idea that Tate Modern would be I don't know what it is now, but a little while ago it was the 4th best visitor centre attraction in the country, you know, and you'd think, you couldn't buy that, you think amazing, but actually, and it is great, but what is it that people are going to see?
Yeah.
They're going to see, basically, it's entertaining.
Mm. Yeah.
And it makes me nervous, it does make me nervous, but on the other hand, so many people are now going to see contemporary art. But what's that contemporary art? And it does appear to be, I think I think a lot of that contemporary art is geared to the marketplace. And I think one of the things that students, for instance, that I'm teaching, I try to help them understand, they don't realise, they think that what they're doing is very anarchic, and actually it's absolutely in line with one of the most capitalist elements of our society, which is the art market. And the link between the two is umbilical. I mean, when I was curating, most of the private galleries would only take an artist after they'd built a career showing in the public sector.
Yeah.
So we were basically funding a commercial market to which there was very little kickback. Occasionally they might pay a little bit into a catalogue, but that would be about it. So I think it's an uneven relationship.
It's a little bit like a dictatorship,
It
isn't
is,
it?
I think so, absolutely.
And there's that, I mean, more people now apparently go to visit galleries rather than go to church. there's an argument that says that the galleries, the big
Become a
galleries,
new
have taken
religion.
over from what you do on a Sunday. You go and see an art exhibition at the Baltic or Tate Modern, whatever, in a big gallery. They're the new destination.
But it is, I mean, I'm not religious, though I'm very interested in respect people. I've always been interested in it, but I'm not. But I do find it interesting that quite a few religions are now looking to entertainment in order to draw people in. You know, so
Yeah.
it's
That's a whole other argument,
Yeah.
isn't it?
Mike, can I ask, getting money from the Arts Council, the competitiveness between all the artists,
yeah.
do you think that is by design, that they've made it so competitive, or do you think it's an accident?
It's a bit of both. I do certainly think that as an arm of the state, and given the way that things have been moving over the last, even with New Labour maybe, over the last 20 odd years, that kind of approach has just been creeping in more and more. And I think that instead of encouraging us to work collectively and together and to support each other in that way, it sets us against each other, and that really worries me. And,
Cool. Well, thanks for that. So I'll hand over to Chris now.
Okay, well I'm going to take a slightly less intellectual approach because I'm just a simple country boy really. I suspect, like Mike's actually really, is pragmatic. I mean, I don't say don't touch anything from anybody, but there are some that I wouldn't touch. Only follow Mike's mentioned one or two. This is not my natural territory, so all I've attempted to do is address a couple of questions that were on the letter of invitation that was sent to me. And one of them was, is philanthropy prompted by benevolence, ego, or reputation management? And the short answer, I think, is it's a combination of all three. And we can all think of examples of people like Carnegie, who in the early part of their life actually did quite a lot of damage to those they employed. He had a reputation as a ruthless and brutal employer, but he never quite forgot his impoverished origins in Scotland. And in the last, did someone say, 18 years of his life, decided to put money back into society for whatever motive. But here we are, 112 years later, sitting in his library here, and I think we have, and the community at large has benefited from the fact that he chose to give away such a large part of his fortune. I think he set up 280 libraries, I read somewhere, so he has made quite a lot of impact, which has greatly far outlived him. I also think that, and this is true of people who made enormous fortunes, not necessarily by fair means or foul, that as you get towards the end of your life, you know you can't take it with you, and you want to be loved, and so you start thinking, well, is there something useful I can do with it all, rather than just leave it? I mean, I think if you're Philip Green, then you don't think that. You think, can I smuggle it all out to Monaco and buy a third yacht? But I don't think that actually leads to happiness. I think you can derive a great deal of happiness from sharing your good fortune, even if your good fortune is on a more modest scale than some. So what I think matters, I don't worry too much about motives. I do worry a little bit about where the money comes from or how it was made. I don't worry about motives, good or bad. What counts is the outcomes. And you can certainly say in Carnegie's case and many others that the outcomes have greatly exceeded any bad they did in their life. And we can all think too of modern day philanthropists, people sharing their wealth on an extraordinary scale, who are doing it actually from probably the highest of motives. And there might be an element of ego involved, but hey, why not? There's an element of ego involved in writing books. or painted pictures, or whatever you do. So, if you take Bill Gates and his wife Melinda, I think if I was asked to draw up a list of my modern day heroes, I think they'd be included. Firstly, I'm sure he was a fairly ruthless entrepreneur, but actually the thing he invented and helped spread around the world is overwhelmingly beneficial, the internet. But having made that vast fortune and accumulated it at a very young age, he isn't spending it on himself or his children or his immediate friends. He's set out in quite a scientific way. I mean, he really is applying himself to, or they have, in spending that money, doing good with it, and it is billions. And I don't think we should look that particular gift horse in the mouth, because I don't think anybody else would necessarily be doing that if he wasn't, or he. So, as I say, there may be an element of ego, but I really don't care about that. Or take the chap who was the subject of a documentary, I think, on Sunday night, was it on BBC Two, George Soros, who thus far has given away $32 billion. Now, I think he's a rather remarkable man. He came up from absolutely nothing, a Jewish refugee in this country. And he founded something called the Open Society Foundation, started I think back in the 60s, giving scholarships to black South Africans in apartheid South Africa, and ended up setting up his own University of Central Europe, I think it's called. It's aimed mainly at the former Eastern Bloc countries, because he is Hungarian, that's where he came from. And he funds a whole range of good causes and foundations that are, the central theme is creating open, tolerant societies. And of course, the dictators don't like him, and some of them, the current management in Hungary, his former country, don't like him. And I'm told, said in this programme the other day, and it was a bit alarming, that on the internet in America, all these things start in America, as we know, all kinds of lunatics are denouncing him for subverting what they see as the one true path, and claiming he's part of some great worldwide conspiracy, for which there's not the slightest evidence. Much of it appeared to be a curious fantasy. If you thought the documentary was quite interesting, it shows, I suppose this is the downside of the internet that Bill Gates had so much to do with, that all these lunatics now have platforms in which they can spin their ludicrous theories. But I think George Soros is a good man of our time, doing something fundamentally good with his life, and I choose to celebrate that. I've got one or two qualifications which I will come to in a minute. Closer to home, there's an interesting example of Bishop Auckland. I don't know whether you're familiar with this. I chaired the Heritage Lottery Fund in the North East for 6 very enjoyable years. Great thing about being involved with the lottery is everybody's glad to see you. But not necessarily the case when you're an MP. You usually only get called in when there's trouble or something's going wrong. But it's certainly, as I say, that's when I used to get asked to open things. There's a man called Jonathan Ruffer, who's a hedge funder, and has made an enormous fortune. He comes from North Yorkshire, actually, and he's set his sights on regenerating poor old Bishop Auckland, which, as you know, is a former the economy of Bishop Auckland years ago was based on coal and I suppose a bit of agriculture, and it's really gone downhill. Although when you look around it, you can see that it was once quite prosperous. It started with I don't think he ever intended it like this, but it started with the Bishop's Palace and the Bishop of Durham's Palace, which was a bit run down, and it did contain, I think, a dozen paintings by a Spanish artist called Zuberon, which were worth millions and millions, much more than the palace. And Church of England was proposing to sell them off because they were desperate for funds. So he bought the Zuberons for about 10 million quid, as you do. And then he decided to buy the palace, which contains the Zuberons, and is spending an enormous amount of money doing that, making it into a regional, actually probably an international attraction. But then his sight strayed beyond the palace and the paintings in it to the whole town. He's bought 2 hotels in the market square. He's bought the municipal car park. He's bought the redundant branch of Barclays Bank, where he's introducing big art exhibitions and all kinds of things that Bishop Auckland has never seen the light of before. And he runs this enormous show, which some of you may have been to, Kinron, which is a huge success. But the obvious of it is he's thinking big. He wants to revive the whole town. We, the lottery, we put in about £10 million, but he's put in around £100 million so far. It's probably the largest single philanthropic project in the UK. And if you've ever met him, he's a thoroughly decent, down-to-earth man who believes that the money that he's earned over his life is quite outrageous when compared with the fortune, and he says so quite openly. And he wants to use it wisely, and he certainly is. Take a more controversial, but I think nonetheless admirable example, the Prince's Foundation, Prince Charles's. Prince Charles has a number of charities, which the biggest I think is the Prince's Foundation, which has devoted it's raised enormous resources, often from wealthy people and corporations, and it's ploughed it back into helping young folk in inner cities get educated, get a skill, and get a life, and on a pretty large scale. And there's a range of other charities that he's got involved in. He's changed tens of thousands of lives for the better. So I forgive him his various eccentricities, because he's done, I think, quite a lot of good in his life. I mean, he spent 65 years waiting to inherit the throne. Now, as we know, Edward VII was in a similar predicament. He just spent his life going around country houses, seducing duchesses and things. But Charles has actually done a lot of good with his life. And if he died tomorrow and never became king, I think he could be said to have led a useful life. So, I mean, he's not necessarily a chip off my particular block, but I salute him for that and forgive him a great deal. Should we ignore the source of philanthropic? Well, no, of course we shouldn't. I think the National Gallery, for example, was quite right to refuse the offer of a donation from an American corporation called Johnson & Johnson, who are at the heart of the opiate scandal in the United States. And why were they right to refuse it? And this is the same, I think, applies to BAE if they're trying to fund, because you've got a chance of influencing their behaviour. And as Mike says, engage with them. Don't just put 2 fingers up with them, engage with them. And it's true of British Petroleum as well, which I think is beginning to invest in renewable energy, isn't it? So I don't think we should ignore necessarily the source of the wealth. I think we should only turn it down if we can make a difference. And in those cases I've mentioned, you perhaps can. It's possible that rejection might influence their future behaviour, but neither, I think, should we be too prissy. I don't know what purpose it would have served if we rejected Andrew Carnegie's money on the grounds that he treated his workers badly. Most employers at that time did. That's another thing. You can't judge the people of the 19th century by the standards of the 21st, which happens quite a lot with all this tearing down of statues and university students, what do they call it, virtue signalling. So as I say, my attitude is purely pragmatic. Now, there is, however, an area, something we are entitled to say about all this philanthropy. that it's not a substitute, not an alternative to paying taxes on your wealth. Taxation fairly raised and wisely spent is the subscription we pay for living in a civilised country. That's what's got us universal education and universal health care and a lot of other things we all believe in. So it's not an alternative, it should be in addition to. And it's quite true that some double standard, a very good article in the Times the other day, about the time I received this invitation by a lady called Janice Turner. And it was about the way that philanthropists or very wealthy people seek to buy themselves absolution for their sins by giving money away. And she put it like this, which I think is rather nice. The Catholic Church stopped selling indulgences in 1567, but a rich sinner can still hope for a fast-track VIP pass through purgatory by donating to charity. Likewise, it's possible to get between a dozen homes, turn remote atolls into your private redoubts, to gobble up the resources of a minor African nation, and still be a saviour of the earth. Yes, indeed. And now again, she says, so the super rich can morally offset their tax avoidance. And some, like Bill and Melinda Gates, who we've spoken about already, truly understand the magnitude of their responsibilities. But the rest can fund a pet cause, get to be called great philanthropists and have a building engraved with their name. Yes, we do need to distinguish between those two types of philanthropists, and I do not think it's at all unreasonable to expect that they pay their taxes. And because one thing, of course, you see, if you give a lot of money to an opera house, say because you're interested in opera or ballet or something quite esoteric and which the majority of citizens, whatever reason, can't or aren't interested in engaging with, that it might buy you kudos with people in high places and your immediate peers, but it doesn't get the litter cleared or the parks maintained or the less glorious. And that comes out of taxation. And as I say, that is the subscription we pay for living in a civilised country. Nor should it buy privilege for the donor, even though we have to acknowledge that it sometimes does. Philanthropy may not buy you a place in heaven, but I'm sorry to say it can buy you a place in the House of Lords. But I conclude on this point, it would be naive to be churlish and to imagine we can do without it. With the best will in the world, the public service cannot fund all the good things in life, nor should we want it to. And finally, this is not absolutely essential, but it does help if you lead a life that reflects the values you espouse. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. So once again, we can have a few minutes just for any questions or clarification on Chris's talk.
I think the point you make about taxation is absolutely crucial, and I think a worry is always that the more we put in, and certainly with my view to the college, the more you put in volunteering and things, if that leads to taking away from state funding, I think it's really, I don't know how we fix that.
Well, it shouldn't do. It's up to those who draw up the rules as regards tax to make sure that those who... and there's certainly a big issue there with these big new corporations like Google and so forth that arrange to be taxed in the places where the lowest... and the Irish, I'm sorry, the Irish government has a few questions to answer there. They've allowed a lot of those companies to set up in Ireland with a specific view to undermining the tax regime elsewhere in Europe.
But I think it's led in times of austerity to kind of pitting parks against swimming pools, against libraries, against paying for us, whatever.
Well, that's always going to be the case, I'm afraid, Mike, isn't it? I mean, that's if you're a councillor, it's a really tough job being a local councillor, because at a time of austerity, all you're really doing is working out what you can save and what you can't save.
But it does depend. It does depend on the level of taxation and how that money then is distributed. Isn't it?
Yeah, well, their job is to work out the priorities on behalf of the rest of us. Actually, Sunderland, sometimes public money can be used to lever in money that wouldn't otherwise be available. So when they went Mowbray Park, for example, or Barnes Park, they got some lottery money, and then they got money from other sources as well. And I thought the council, in Straighten Time, did a pretty good job of refurbishing those two parks. I've been out at Doxford Park this morning, where they've got plans to try and do something there. It's all a bit overgrown, and they can put some money in. I'm surprised to hear, but they can't put much of it in, and so they've got to raise money from elsewhere. Likewise with libraries. I mean, there was an issue coming with libraries anyway. Many of them were underused, really underused, with the coming of the internet and all the rest of it. And so what you have to do is adapt to that, as has been the case here. It's quite a good example, actually. And give people a reason to come through the door.
Well, Chris, I'm not a politician. You have been, and presumably still are to a degree. My limited knowledge of it suggests that there's been a considerable decrease in central funding for to local authorities.
40%.
40%. So, I mean, is that purely down to the crash in the market, or is it also down to a set of priorities that exists and is driving a certain approach to things? And which also, I mean, I agree with your thing about leveraging money, and I don't think for a minute that any artist has a right to funding. However, what that has meant, for instance, as a kind of ideology, is that when you now apply for funding, you probably had this when you were sitting on the HLF panel, and certainly in Arts Council, although they'd never say, I would suggest that unless you can bring 30% of funding against what you're doing,
yes,
you're not going to get money.
Right, yes.
And I think that has skewed what people can get and apply for, and that again is a worry, and that's down to the lack of funding.
I'm not sure it is a worry. I don't think it's ever very healthy when just one person or one organisation writes out a cheque for something. It does put an onus on those with the ambition and the plan to work hard to try and impress those. And the lottery insists on quite a lot of, it has quite a lot of benchmarks. One of which argued that it involves young people. They won't just pay to do up Doxford Park. They'll want to know what volunteers are there. They want to see evidence as volunteers with an interest, first of all.
And I mean, one of the things I was suggesting is there has to be, you have to underpin the way money's given out with a certain ideology. And in my case, I think it has to be our stewardship of the planet, actually, which is the biggest problem I think we face overall. So I wouldn't deny that, and I don't deny either that, that could be an important part, but not the only part. And the feeling I get is it's increasingly becoming the only kind of driver in a way. If you don't bring that money with you, you're very unlikely to get funding, whereas it ought to be part of.
Well, there's lots of trusts and charities around that can be. I mean, I sit on something called the North of England Civic Trust, and they basically do up old buildings that are in steep decline or have been derelict for years in many cases. Well, yes, in High Street East, the old Corn Exchange, that's a civic trust project, and the Eagle Workshop next to it. But they want to see it generating some funds first, once you've done it. There's no point putting money in it, it will go into decline again, so you've got to have a use for it for a start. With the lottery, for example, they want to see schools involved, for example, in the wall garden at Doxford Park, growing their own vegetables, or they want to see it used for groups that have got problems like, well, there's a group of dementia sufferers, for example, who use the park, and they want to see them involved one way or another. So I don't think that's a bad thing. Often they can be rather more rigorous than a local authority just writing out a cheque. In schools, the first thing that happened when in the Thatcher years, when the cuts, there's quite a lot of cuts, was that school music went. That was the first. It's always the non-statutory. The councils have got a lot of statutory obligations. They are obliged to look after the to fund social services and education by law. And so those are the budgets that can't be cut. So the budgets that get cut are the ones that are picking up the litter and clearing up the roadsides, and you can see it actually, you notice as you drive around. Or the ones that are optional, the maintenance of the parks, libraries. Even the central library here has retreated into a building half the size, hasn't it?
But it's like a new building-ish. So
It's actually going to happen, is it? Yes, good.
Yeah, they've been promised the elephant tea rooms.
The what rooms?
Elephant tea rooms, opposite Mackey's.
Oh, I know where that is, yes. Yes.
They're moving some of their service into there, and that's going to be...
Is that big enough? I don't know.
Well, it's not the whole library, it's just part of it. And
Ah.
then they're going to stick part of it in the Winter Gardens, and then they're doing some changes around.
I see. I mean, I thought their previous... When I first came here in 1985, the first thing that happened very shortly afterwards was that the two House of Fraser stores collapsed. After House of Fraser were allowed to set up at the Metro Centre, they collapsed the House of Fraser stores in South Shields, Sunderland. I've forgotten the third one down the road, and I think the one in Newcastle as well. And anyway, that was both sides of Fawcett Street, the main shopping street at that time. And so a use had to be found. For a long time, if you walked to the railway station, you went through a corridor boarded up, really demoralising for corridor boarded up plate glass windows. And then, so they moved the library onto the top floor, or the upper two floors. There was an art gallery, wasn't there? And the job centre, I think, onto the lower floor. And then they managed to sell the other side to Wilkins. I think that was still there. So the council, especially in an area like this, is constantly combating problems, unforeseen problems that come out of the blue and hit you. I mean, look now, for example. It looks to me, I don't know, that Debenhams probably wobbling. Now Debenhams was set up amidst very high hopes, and it anchors that little part of the town, no, that large part of the town. I hope it's going to be all right, but a lot of Debenhams stores around the country are closing. No sooner had Debenhams set up than Joplins went down. No sooner had I moved out of here than the high school at the Gray Road collapsed, or was closed down. And so it looks as though they've begun. And that had some of the finest buildings in the city, the Langham, for example, the lovely Gothic mansion on the corner there. I gather, I just had a walk round there this morning before I came here, that that a use has been found for them. I think it'll work out all right. But it's a constant struggle, adjusting various priorities. And things like libraries and parks and things that are optional are often the first to go. So you do have to involve some philanthropic money in the age we live in.
I think that's one of the objections that within the other, and the artists who were involved in that had the Great Exhibition of the North. This idea we had that actually this was all about, generated from Osborne and his ideas about the Northern Powerhouse, and it was about creating an image of Newcastle and Gateshead in the north, which was about inward investment, about tourist money. It had very little to do really with local communities, and possibly the rest to do with local artists and other people in the creative industries who were working in the town. And again, I think we can certainly understand that approach. The council was very keen on it. The cultural institutions were very keen to kind of do it, see what they could make of it. But it kind of creates a kind of an economy which doesn't necessarily benefit people who are living in these cities, in these towns. And it's how we, one of our arguments was actually how do you use the spaces within the city centre to benefit artists and people working in creative industries and maybe small businesses. There were some examples in the centre of Newcastle, office blocks which had been turned over, the Newbridge project occupied one of them, that was torn down, the council found them another area. But it's almost an argument on how do we use civic space, how do we use public space, and I was going to take a little bit of the topic of philanthropy here, but who's in control of that?
Well, let me take a specific example. I'm not, artists among us may not be very pleased to hear this. Most of the contents appear to be absolutely done. And so the artists have got a few questions to answer about that. It's not made, in my mind, look at the number of directors it's had, if you want to think, which is a sure sign that there's something not quite right. I think that a lot of effort there has been wasted. It's still redeemable. Perhaps it has been redeemed. I haven't seen for a while. I think the use made of the biscuit factory. Did I hear you or something about the biscuit factory? I think that's good. That's very smart.
Although that's very much a commercial enterprise, the biscuit factory.
Well, yeah, maybe a commercial enterprise, but there do appear to be a lot of artists selling things.
Well, there are.
Yeah, that's the problem.
Well, I suppose,
Yeah,
I suppose the current director of the Baltic, Sarah Monroe, I think to give her due, she is more focused on trying to engage with the community.
Absolutely, I think it's been a breath of fresh air.
Yeah, I think but then it's been given this, it's been set up to show contemporary art, and that potentially is a difficulty if you want to bring different people in, because contemporary art can be rather difficult, baffling, and it can be rubbish sometimes. Yeah, you can walk around and think.
You mentioned the Tate Modern, and again, I think we're destined to disagree here. I went round it, and I wasn't that impressed by the contents. It's again a very interesting building, and a good use of an interesting building. I thought it might just be me, so I sat down for a while and watched the people going round to see whether they weren't paying much attention to the exhibits, I felt. And what I did notice they were riveted by was the view of St Paul's Cathedral from the cafe on the third floor. Again, if I was running the Tate Modern, I'd want to ask myself why that was.
Can I just... all these things are quite complex, and if I can give you an example going back many years to something which I tried to set up, failed to do, if I outline the thinking behind it. Some of you may remember that I organised the first and second time internationals. I set them up and organised them, and they were based on bringing international art into towns like keep the people here and get them to engage with local communities. And the idea then was to build on that. We piggybacked onto the Gate of God Festival and onto the Tall Ships Race as well as that. It was a good engagement with the kind of local economy. But the idea had been to use what is now Malmaison as a kind of Deer Foundation type building with experimental work. It's now in Baltic, but it would have been there in Newcastle. But there was a reason for that, not just purely to have that, but the idea was because it would be run by Town and Weir Museum and linked to the Lang Art Gallery where I worked. We also did a survey, we also had a feasibility study done to look at generating income from underground parking there, linking the Lang to the library. And through the exhibitions that were enabled down on the quayside, which we'd been promised funding from the Town and Weir Development Corporation for 5 years, capital and revenue funding, we would generate enough interest around an elite group of people who own the major artists like Monet and Cézanne and all the rest of it, so that we might be able to then, in the Lang, have major exhibitions of the kind of key modern artists like Cézanne and Monet and Degas and the rest of it. Because it's very difficult to get those exhibitions up here, because the lenders say, well, why do we want to go to Newcastle or Sunderland? What's in it for us? What is particularly unique about going there? Whereas if you have a real reputation for cutting edge, leading arguments, leading debates within the cultural sector, then there is some kind of kudos for them coming there. So that's the kind of rounded approach I think I would like to argue for. So you don't see something like gold ever in isolation. It's a complex ecology, really.
Yes, I don't see the Baltic in isolation. Its location's a very fine one. It's got that magnificent sage concert hall next door. It's got lots of interesting things happening on the quayside. I think all that's, as a whole, that area's worked out very well compared with how it was. And indeed, Sunderland didn't do a bad job of revitalising the north side of the
St. Pete through the glass
the glass centre, St. Peter's, and all the way out.
Incidentally, in terms of bringing things together, some of you may know the art school is finally going to move down to St. Peter's en bloc rather than in different bits and pieces, which is thank God for that.
Good. Anyway, we seem to have wandered off the subject.
Well, in a productive way. I think.
But not so much actually, because they are. I mean,
Anyway, just before we move on to the next part,
is that the food?
no, it's me going over what you've already said, probably. Has anybody got any final questions or just a bit of clarification from what Chris had to say?
Yeah, I'd just like to, I know it's not exactly to do with philanthropy, but to me the visual arts is so different to, say, somebody going studying architecture, somebody going into theatre even, or whatever. All seem to have structures that the visual arts just lack. It seems to me there's a big gap somewhere in the visual arts. I mean, because the architects will have their own very powerful organisation. I can't remember the name of it. Yeah. And the same with theatre. I mean, you know, they seem to have, maybe not so much, but
I think that's because they
a lot of big organisations that can bring in people at a younger age and train them up themselves after they've left college and all that. So to me, the visual arts suffers from that.
Tony, I think that one of the reasons for that is to do with the teaching, actually, and the way that visual arts has developed, and it's down to this idea of individualism and working on your own and not working collectively. You know, architects work well together, they work with people in spaces, they work with corporations, they work with city councils, so that's part of the engagement they have. Theatres is all about working together. You know, in the cinema, you've got, in the film industry, you've got huge crews which build these things, whereas artists kind of work individually in isolation. And I think that is a big problem, actually, which we need to overcome.
My BA had a collective module.
Pardon?
My BA had a collective module. It was hell. So, yeah, I mean, it was art, so it is tricky to do collective
It is
modules in
tricky.
fine art.
So could you just ask what was tricky about it?
It was just wasn't bad. We kind of just got grouped together and told to get on with it. And big groups, like groups of 5. And, you know.
It does require, it's not something that you can just lump people together. It's really difficult. I mean, we've just set up a module now where all the different, this is something you won't have experienced, but all the different courses, so fine art, fashion, advertising, design, all work collaboratively together on a live project which is actually about environmental issues. So they have to solve the problem together and come up with photography as well. So you're working together as a team. The first iteration of that didn't go down terribly well, absolutely so, but we're not giving up on that. We're just trying to work through and make sure how it will work, not the other way around. Yeah. I mean, Ralph, who teaches in Germany, said, some of you know Ralph Bro, who teaches in this, he said he couldn't understand it, and he still can't when he comes here, that most artists in the studios turn their faces away from the centre and work in the corner. They don't work outwards and talk to people, and it's kind of culture that we've got. And it's about, you know, as Chris was saying, it's about engaging not just with each other, but with all the other elements that make up society. We're no better, or you know, we haven't got the moral imperative, we're not better. We just have a particular approach that we take, and we need to engage with the planners, with the businesses and all the rest of it.
And I think that's one of the questions for ourselves to ask ourselves. How do we do? What do we do next? Philanthropy clearly is something which it's a ride or does. It's not going to go away. is part of this mixed economy which includes state funding and such like. So how do we respond to that as artists? People are interested in creative industries. I suppose one of the dangers or one of the pleasures maybe of coming last in the speakers list is everybody said a lot of stuff before you don't say. So I'll probably skip quite quickly through this, and then we can have a quick cup of tea and then come back to some more discussion. But one thing I was wanting to ask is just who in the room has given to charity before, made a donation.
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Who has given to charity before? Who has made a donation to a charity in the past? So, probably everyone in the room. And who might call themselves a philanthropist?
No billionaires in Hendon, are there? I know.
Exactly.
Or Durham.
Well, I'm not so sure about that.
No, quite, yeah. No, there might be.
Actually, you've got, who's your man, Bardi?
Oh, yeah.
I don't know whether he's a billionaire, but he's actually rescued Bede House, hasn't he?
We used to have the Red Vardy Gallery in Sunderland Hendon.
Yeah, that's right, yes. And the other one, Tom Cowie, who was the other
Oh,
manager,
yeah.
he gave away a lot of money to good causes, all sorts into schools, all sorts.
I mean, one of the reasons I asked that is philanthropy really, I think, starts originally as an act of giving, as an act of generosity. That's its kind of its root definition. It's not necessarily what I think it is now, largely about wealth management, to some degree, tax efficiency, and a word we came through about a lot last year during the great exhibition in the north, art washing for those with a kind of questionable background, and doing a bit of reading around this topic before today. I came across a phrase I hadn't seen before, which was philanthrocapitalism. So if this was on a website from a kind of wealth management company, so if you are a high net worth or an ultra high net worth individual, one of the 1% or the 0.01%, these are the companies that will help you effectively manage your wealth, and part of that is around philanthropy, and some of that may be quite genuine, and there's touch a bit later on. I won't say too much about Jonathan Ruffer, because I think he's an interesting example, and obviously he is local. Clearly some of it is a bit more questionable. I mean, just some figures. Found on websites from these wealth management companies in 2015. Maybe perhaps the nearest latest information. The private wealth of high net worth individuals was £1.5 trillion in the UK, of which 1.3 billion, so 0.1%, had been given away in philanthropy or charitable giving, so quite a small percentage. There are what I don't want to do is just whinge about the rich and whinge about the wealthy. There are foundations in the North East, the Weir Foundation, and the County Durham Foundation, and the sort of Teesside, which accept donations from people who are wealthy, people who aren't particularly wealthy, use that to create endowments, and they fund voluntary groups, community groups, often working at a grassroots level. They'll put money into the arts group. And they've, together in the past next year for figures being available, I've got to think about £11 million, those two foundations alone, into community-based work. So, as Chris and as Mike have said, philanthropy is part of the economy we're working with. And the Wealth Tree Foundations are more directly, where you can't sort of get away from it. However, I was having a look through Raymond Williams' book, Key Words. Raymond Williams being a cultural theorist working in the 1960s, 1970s. And he lists these words which he felt were kind of, key words within the kind of political and cultural discourse, and describes the meaning and describes how the meaning has changed over time. So there are words like common, commons, words like ordinary, popular. And ordinary, began in the 17th century, apparently as just a reference. It was a name for a kind of an eating house which sold fixed price meals. About 100 years or so later, was carried implications around social superiority or inferiority. And now it's something's ordinary, it's generally considered, without any particular value or distinction to it. And words like common and commons have made a similar kind of journey, almost be something which kind of well-known into something which I think defined people's place within a society. And it seems to me that the point that Williams was trying to make there is how you use language, how you use certain words to describe ourselves, to describe our place and our relationships to each other. And philanthropy is another one of these words, perhaps more technical, but it's about sort of saying that perhaps I'm in a particular place in comparison to you who are a person, an ordinary or a common person. And I think philanthropy creates these kind of divisions, and I think as Chris and Mike sort of touched on earlier, there is a kind of virtue signalling perhaps if you're giving thousands or perhaps millions of pounds away to the poor. And one of the things that seems to be quite commonly said about rich people giving their money away is they want to give something back, they want to help people in a more deprived situation, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But again, just how far does this go, particularly if, as we've seen, according to figures, the proportion, the percentage of wealth given away from high net worth individuals is actually very small. John Berger makes a similar point in an essay, writing about the kind of the love of art and culture amongst the Euro ruling classes, so where they can claim virtue through their love of beauty and good taste, and connections themselves with earlier days, as it were. So if we, so that's kind of takes us a wee bit away again from this idea of philanthropy and good causes. But I think philanthropy does sit in a category, where it's a broader category, which again we touched on a bit in the discussion and what Mike and Chris have said, where you do have sponsorship, the likes of BP and BA Systems, and we're starting to see reactions against that. The other was one example has been Nan Goldin's protests against the involvement of the Sackler Foundation in exhibitions. And although Elizabeth Sackler, who's kind of part of the British part of the family, has protested that actually they have nothing to do with the American part of the family, which have the shares in Purdue Pharma, the Sacklers are still. What we have to question is if they are given their name, they've put a lot of money in a lot of the institutions that we've mentioned earlier on. Are they essentially kind of cleansing their name despite what they say and their activities elsewhere, particularly in the opioid scandal? Now, one of the things that as Chris was saying about Jonathan Ruffer, interesting character, has given away quite a lot of his wealth so far. In the Times philanthropy, Times giving list, Ruffer appears at the top of that list by quite some margin, actually. And if you compare the people on the Times giving list with the Times rich list, and particularly the top 20 people whose wealth amounts to something like 62 or 162 billion to get within that 20. There's some names which are completely absent from the giving list, so they may or may not be giving away money to charity. But So Ruffer sort of come in to Bishop Auckland, as Chris said, he sort of, it almost sounds like accidental through buying the Zipper
Yeah, I think it
things.
was.
And then kind of got drawn in. He also has some connections with the North. He was born in North Yorkshire. And it is now sort of doing a lot within the town to, I suppose, regenerate it and to do what Chris was a member of Parliament, government would have done through regeneration monies, through which is something which quickly disappeared from the scene when the coalition government came into power, and had quite a significant effect on civil society at local level, certainly in the North East. I think, again, from what I've read, Chris, you probably met him, Ruffer does seem a genuine character. He's quite a devout Christian, I believe, and some of that sort of seems to influence what he does. I think he wants to create, I've read, a sort of pilgrim's trail through the Northeast, kind of recognising the Northeast place, particularly in early Christianity. Which I think it's a good thing. You know, I'm just like, I'm not particularly religious. It does concern me though that what we're seeing in some of these cases, and maybe that's one, is that the view of one person starts to influence our idea of what our impression of what a particular town or city or culture or society is like, and we're giving that over to people with an awful lot of money. Another thing, I suppose, about Jonathan Ruffer, not necessarily himself, but I suppose the kind of idea of Ruffer as an individual that's created, perhaps created by the press. Read this article about him in the Telegraph. Is that he's coming in, he's doing this all his own money, not without, as the Telegraph seems to trumpet, without any EU money, without any government investment, without any kind of state help, and suggesting that this was, I think, in some ways better or purer or whatever. But it kind of creates this idea, I think, of the great man, the great individual who comes in and makes a difference, who somehow has qualities which the rest of us perhaps lack. Again, going back to that idea that we perhaps are ordinary, whereas our friends, the philanthropists, are in some way special. So the question then, I think, for us, and maybe we come back to after the break, is actually, again, what does this mean for us as artists? I think we have to some extent, accept these as facts of life at the moment, as what we're kind of working through, but can we challenge that? Can we, in some way, use our influences or our work practices, I touched a wee bit on this, to try and resist what might be some of the worst aspects of philanthropic giving?
I think it's a good point to end as well. What can we as a community of artists, what are our strengths?
Yeah.
What can we contribute? Because I think we contribute an awful lot sometimes we don't.
Just sort of another example of local example, very local example of philanthropy from which all of us who live around here have benefited, at Backhouse Park. Backhouse Park belonged to the Backhouse family, whose bank became one of the banks that established Barclays. And when they died or moved out, they gave it to the local authority. And as I say, we've all benefited.
And it was an art school for many.